The sound of sirens fills the night over Gaza, sharp, endless, and terrifying. Mothers hold lifeless children in their arms, doctors dig through rubble with bare hands, and fathers bury tiny bodies in silence. But tonight, we are not only watching Gaza, we are watching what is left of our shared humanity. In a world where truth is sold and lives are measured in barrels of oil, what does it mean to be human anymore? The same Western nations that once claimed to bring civilization to Africa now defend bombings as self-defense. They switch off their screens, they close their eyes, and they call silence diplomacy. But tell me, where is the right of a child to breathe? Where is the right of a people simply to exist? What they call a conflict, we must call a massacre. What they call collateral damage history, we'll remember as a crime against humanity. And every bomb that falls on Gaza falls symbolically on Africa, on the villages once burned by colonizers, on the memory of Patrice Lumumba, on the dreams of Thomas Sankara. Gaza today is the Africa of yesterday, and the Africa of today is Gaza under another name, because injustice anywhere is a threat everywhere. When one nation is allowed to destroy another in the name of security, it is the future of all nations that burns. To remain silent is to betray the conscience that makes us human. So tonight, let's not look at Gaza through the cold lenses of news anchors who count deaths like statistics. Let's look with our hearts, the way a grandmother in Burkina Faso looks at a child suffering on the screen, whispering a prayer for peace that still means something. Do you still believe that peace built on silence is peace at all? Or have we all become too comfortable with other people's pain? Please share if you still believe that compassion is stronger than politics. Subscribe if you believe that the truth matters more than the headlines. When the speaker said Gaza is not alone, the words carried more than sympathy, they carried history. In that moment, Gaza became a mirror for Africa, reflecting centuries of pain, betrayal, and silence. The burning streets of Gaza and the dusty roads of Ouagadougou suddenly felt like one continuous map, one where oppression simply changed names, uniforms, and flags. The speech begins by breaking the illusion of distance. Gaza, the speaker insists, is not far from us. Every explosion there echoes through the villages of Africa, where memory still trembles under the shadow of empire. Gaza, he says, is the voice of Lumumba, silenced the cry of Sankara, interrupted the humiliation of a continent once told it was free while still chained by debt. The event described isn't a single battle or a political summit, it's a moral reckoning. It's the day when an African voice stood before the world and said what many were afraid to say, that the same powers who enslaved Africa now defend their crimes in Palestine with the same vocabulary, civilization, order, security. Only the victims change. The structure remains. Through vivid images, the speaker rebuilds Gaza. In our imagination, mothers running through the dust with their children in their arms, fathers clawing through debris with bleeding hands, schools and hospitals turned into graves of silence. The audience can almost hear the cries, smell the smoke, and feel the hypocrisy that coats the language of peacekeeping. And then he draws the line of comparison. When our villages burned, they called it progress. When our people resisted, they called it rebellion. Now they call Gaza's defense terrorism. The speaker reminds listeners that the vocabulary of power never changes, only the geography does. From the Congo to Palestine, from the Sahel to the West Bank, the same excuses justify the same violence. The same cameras that once ignored African suffering now broadcast Gaza's pain through a cold, filtered lens. This is where the speech transforms from testimony into accusation. The West is not just silent, it is complicit. It preaches democracy while funding bombs, speaks of human rights while selling arms, and claims moral authority while denying humanity to those it deems inconvenient. They speak of freedom, he says, but they imprison entire nations behind walls and sanctions. For the African audience, and especially for the elders who remember the colonial past, these words strike deep. The voice from the stage becomes the echo of every lost hero, every buried revolution. The speech revives the idea that Africa's liberation is not complete as long as Gaza remains under siege, because both share the same enemy, a world system that thrives on inequality, fear, and moral blindness. Each child killed in Gaza, the speaker says slowly, is a failure of our collective humanity. Each silence is a crime. Each manipulated headline is a bullet against the truth. The scene shifts from horror to defiance. Despite the ruins, he tells of children in Gaza who still smile, who play with scraps of metal as if building the future. Women who pull survivors from rubble. Men who bury their dead and return to rebuild again. That courage, he declares, is not only theirs, it belongs to all of us who refuse to surrender our dignity. And in that defiance, Gaza becomes more than a tragedy. It becomes a symbol of human endurance, of moral clarity, and of the silent bond that ties oppressed peoples across continents. The speaker calls it the breath of human dignity, something no empire can crush, no propaganda can erase. The section ends with a declaration that defines the rest of the speech. It is not Gaza that is at war. It is the entire world at war with its own conscience. That line hits like thunder. It reframes Gaza not as a political issue, but as a moral X-ray exposing the sickness of a civilization that has learned to live comfortably beside injustice. From the quiet sorrow of Gaza's ruins, the speech erupts into a storm. The calm, reflective tone gives way to moral fire, a voice that no longer pleads, but accuses. This is where compassion becomes confrontation. The speaker raises his hand and points at the West, not as a geographic place, but as an empire of hypocrisy. They cry for Ukraine, he says, but when Gaza burns, their silence becomes a religion. The hall trembles with applause and anger. He paints the contrast in painful detail, the blue and yellow flags, the concerts, the tears, the world's cameras following every Ukrainian child, and then the ashes of Gaza, nameless, faceless, abandoned. No concerts, no flags, no grief televised. The accusation is not just political, it's spiritual. Two humanities, he says, two measures. Those 5 words slice through centuries of polite diplomacy. In them lies the central thesis: the Western moral order was never universal. It was always conditional, for allies compassion, for others condemnation. Then the speech turns its fury toward the media, the silent army of empire. France, 24. CNN, BBC. He calls them by name. They do not inform the world, they hypnotize it. He accuses them of turning journalism into weaponry, of editing truth until suffering looks justified. When a European child dies, they mourn for weeks. When 100 children from Gaza are buried, they change the subject. The audience gasps, not because they doubt it, but because someone finally dares to say it aloud. The speech compares these broadcasters to soldiers of disinformation. They no longer protect truth, they crucify it. The word crucify draws a sharp breath. Its religious weight transforms the argument from politics to morality, from news to sin. And yet, amid this fury, there's a profound sadness. The speaker admits, we no longer need CNN to speak the truth. The people will speak it. He calls for something radical, a Pan-African and global Southern media revolution. Not state propaganda, but liberation media built by the youth, sustained by conscience, powered by technology. He envisions a world where an African child can tell Gaza's story, and a Gazan child can speak to Africa without filters, without permission. The day we build that network, he declares, fear will change sides. The line lands like a prophecy. Then comes the most explosive part, the challenge to Africa's leaders. Where are our presidents when bombs fall on hospitals, he demands? Where are our ambassadors, our ministers, our men who love microphones at international summits but lose their voices when justice calls? He answers his own question with brutal honesty, because many of our leaders are not free. Their speeches, he says, are written in Washington, Paris, London, Brussels, their votes at the UN, dictated by the same powers that once drew the borders of their nations. The silence of African governments he calls a betrayal not only of Gaza, but of Africa itself. The crowd is no longer silent. Every sentence feels like a drumbeat. Every word tears at the comfortable lies of neutrality. The phrase neutralité honteuse, shameful neutrality, echoes like a curse. He reminds them that Africa of all continents should be the first to rise when a people is crushed. Have we forgotten our own Gazas, he asks. Our own villages bombed, our children massacred, our cultures erased. In this section, the speech reaches its emotional peak. The call is not for revenge, but for dignity, not for war, but for courage. We must rise as one, he says. Not to attack, but to say to the world, we will no longer be accomplices to the crimes of the powerful. The applause swells, but the face of the speaker remains solemn. This is not triumph, it's awakening. His voice softens. Silence today prepares the bombs of tomorrow. And then, as if speaking directly to every hesitant leader, every silent intellectual, he warns power without truth is an illusion. History will judge harshly those who preferred comfort over courage. The climax ends not in anger, but in a vow, a solemn oath shared between Gaza and Africa. If Gaza lives, Africa still breathes. If Gaza dies, humanity itself will fade. The hall falls silent. The moral line has been drawn. No one can claim neutrality anymore. After the fire of accusation comes the deep silence of consequence. The speech moves from the thunder of truth to the aftermath it demands the political and moral cost of staying silent. In this part, the voice no longer points outward. It turns inward toward Africa itself. We have cried too, he says. Our ancestors called for justice, and the world answered with cannons. It is a confession and a reminder. The pain of Gaza is not foreign. It is the echo of every African cry ignored, every village erased, every child forgotten by history. The political consequence of that silence, he warns, is not just moral decay, it is the slow death of sovereignty. The speaker explains how too many African nations are still governed by invisible hands, their loans, their votes, their policies dictated from Western capitals. Our presidents, he laments, speak with borrowed voices. Their speeches are written in Paris and Brussels, not in Ouagadougou or Bamako. This is not mere rhetoric, it's a statement of dependency. Political independence, he argues, without moral independence is an illusion. As long as our consciences are colonized, we remain prisoners even under our own flags. The crowd murmurs not with surprise, but with recognition. Everyone knows it. Few dare to say it. The speech turns this truth into a challenge. If Africa's silence over Gaza continues, it is not only Gaza that suffers, it is Africa's soul that corrodes. The silence of today prepares the bombs of tomorrow, he repeats this time as a warning to his own continent. And yet he refuses despair. He imagines a turning point, the moment when silence transforms into a cry, and that cry into a movement. This continent, he says, can still become the voice of the world. Then comes the political proposal, grounded in moral clarity. Let African embassies speak, not hide behind protocol. Let African universities debate freely, not fear foreign donors. Let Pan-African media show what Western cameras hide. Let ordinary people march for justice, not for applause. Each line builds a civic roadmap, not for war, but for courage. The power he calls for is not military, it is moral. I am not talking about hatred, he insists, I am talking about dignity, not war, but courage. Not revenge, but truth. He directly addresses African elites, presidents, ministers, first ladies, those who live within palaces built on silence. You fear losing your privileges, he says quietly. But power without truth is only a shadow, and history will judge those who chose silence over justice. The civil consequence becomes clear. If Africa continues to trade its moral voice for loans and comfort, it will forfeit the respect of its own people. Neutrality, he says, is no longer neutrality, it is complicity. And yet his conclusion turns from accusation to hope. He envisions an Africa united by conscience, not by convenience, a continent where the suffering of one nation moves the hearts of all. We will no longer be spectators of injustice, he declares. We will become witnesses of truth, defenders of the forgotten, allies of the oppressed. Then he gives the line that transforms politics into principle: if Gaza lives, then Africa still breathes. But if Gaza dies, our humanity is buried with it. The applause that follows is not loud, but long. It carries grief, pride, and the beginning of something larger, a civic awakening, a rebirth of Africa's moral duty. And in that moment, the hall feels like a courtroom of history. The verdict is not on Gaza alone, it is on all who choose silence. As the echoes of the speech ripple outward, the message extends beyond Africa toward America, Europe, and the larger world. The words are no longer confined to the continent. They challenge the conscience of the global order itself. For the American listener, especially those who lived through the civil rights era, the voice from Africa sounds hauntingly familiar. It speaks the same moral language once heard in the voices of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, the language of truth against comfortable power. The speaker's charge is clear. The crisis in Gaza is not a regional war. It is the mirror of our world's values. He points out that what is unfolding in Palestine, the control of land, of narrative of history, is only possible because powerful nations allow it. They claim to defend freedom, he says, but they decide which freedom deserves to live. The same double standard that kept Africa under control for centuries now sustains new empires through banks, through weapons, through media. In this light, the United States and Europe appear not as saviors, but as architects of a global system designed to maintain dependence. The speaker calls it the invisible doctrine of domination. Human rights, democracy, and development, all beautiful words, but often wielded like tools of influence. They built their civilization on the suffering of others, he says. And they still sell that suffering as peace. The reaction abroad is divided. Western media labels such speeches as populist or anti-Western. But across Latin America, Asia, and the Arab world, the message resonates deeply. Leaders from Venezuela, Bolivia, and Indonesia quote fragments of it. Independent journalists in Brazil and South Africa replay the lines, two humanities, two measures. The internet spreads the clip far beyond what any state broadcaster could have done. In Washington, analysts call it dangerous rhetoric. In Paris, diplomats describe it as unhelpful. Yet on the streets of Accra, Nairobi, and Johannesburg, people repeat its words with pride. The world, it seems, is beginning to divide not between East and West, but between those who still believe in moral truth and those who serve economic interests dressed as values. The speaker's global vision goes further. He calls for a new alliance of the global South Africa, Latin America, Asia, to share not weapons, but wisdom, not exploitation, but equity. Imagine, he says, a world where Africa's resources serve Africans, where Latin America feeds its children before it feeds the market, where Asia's innovation lifts all humanity. This is not mere utopia, it's a strategy of moral rebalancing. The true war, he insists, is not between nations, but between truth and hypocrisy. They fear change, he adds, because their power depends on our divisions. But suffering unites more deeply than treaties. For American audiences, the line strikes a personal chord. What is freedom? He asks if it means turning away from injustice. It recalls the same ethical tension that once shaped America's own battles for civil rights and peace. By the end of this section, the speech reframes global politics as a battle for the soul of humanity. Empires can control markets, weapons, and information, but not the collective awakening of conscience now rising from the South. And when he says the day Gaza breathes freely, the world will finally know peace, it no longer sounds like an idealist's dream. It sounds like prophecy. When the hall finally fell silent, it wasn't the silence of fatigue. It was the silence of reflection. The kind of silence that comes when truth leaves no room for excuses. Gaza was no longer just a tragedy far away. It had become a moral mirror held up to every nation, every leader, and every citizen who still claims to have a conscience. The speaker's final words did not promise revenge. They promised awakening. In the ruins, he said, there is still light. In every bombed hospital, a doctor still saves a life. In every destroyed school, a child still dreams. Hope, he reminded the world, is stronger than the bombs, because hope is not a word, it's an action. He warned that the real danger ahead is not war itself, but the normalization of injustice, a world so numb that it can scroll past human suffering without a heartbeat of sorrow. We cannot build peace on the bones of children, he said. We cannot sleep peacefully on mass graves. These words, carried far beyond the walls of the assembly, became a moral alarm to those who still believe humanity can do better. The vision he left us with is not one of utopia, but of responsibility. Africa must rise not just to protest, but to build, to create independent media, to invest in conscience-driven education, to nurture leaders who speak for truth, not for sponsors. Gaza's cry must not end as an image on a screen. It must become a catalyst for action for every citizen, every teacher, every elder who remembers what justice once meant. He called upon the global South, from Africa to Latin America, from Asia to the Middle East, to forge a new moral alliance, not based on fear or profit, but on dignity, compassion, and truth. The powerful build walls, he said. But truth has wings. It will fly over their lies and knock on their doors with the wind of the south. And then his voice softened to a prayer not just for Gaza, but for all humanity. If Gaza survives, the world survives. If Gaza falls, the soul of humanity falls with it. Tonight, that call still lingers, not as politics, but as prophecy. It asks each of us a question we can no longer avoid. Do we want to live in a world of comfort built on silence, or a world of truth built on courage? Please share if you believe that compassion must never be censored. Subscribe if you believe that the truth from Gaza to Burkina Faso will always outlive the lie. Because for Ibrahim Traoré, for Burkina Faso, and for all who still follow Africa, the struggle for dignity is not about borders. It's about who we choose to be when the world stops watching.